Welcome back to Coffee Break Science. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Kat Arney today. Kat's an award-winning science writer, public speaker, and broadcaster, and the founder and chief creative officer of First Create the Media, communications and marketing agency for innovative life science companies. Kat has a degree in natural sciences and a PhD from here in Cambridge, and did 2 short postdocs in Cambridge and London. And after leaving the lab, she spent 12 years working for Cancer Research UK, where she co-founded the charity's groundbreaking science blog and acted as a principal media spokesperson. She's the author of 3 popular science books, Herding Hemingway's Cats, How to Code a Human, and Rebel Cell, and has presented numerous podcasts and BBC Radio 4 shows, including Ingenious, which was a series of short stories about our genes and a bug in the system, a 3-part flagship documentary series about the past, present, and future of cancer. So I'm really excited to have you here. Thank you so much.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
So you've had a really interesting path from being a scientist here at the University of Cambridge and doing the science and looking at genetics to becoming a science communicator at CRUK to then becoming an award-winning author of 3 books, the latest of which I have here in my hand, Rebel Cell.
Available in all good and evil bookshops.
So can you walk us through the evolution of your career and how you went from the lab to being an author and many other things?
So yeah, my story, basically I kind of a kid who was like a nerdy science kid, but also a kind of arty writing drama kid. So my mother was like a English graduate, and like I grew up in a house full of books and putting on plays and local pantos and all sorts of things. So I always loved like sort of storytelling and writing and reading and all that kind of stuff. But I also really loved science. I was really into nature. I had a chemistry set when I was quite young. I was just absolutely fascinated by that. Like you could mix these chemicals together and they could change colour and do all sorts of interesting things. I kept snails in my bedroom at one point, very unsuccessfully. I was just always really fascinated by how the world worked and science and things like that. And so it seemed fairly obvious that I was going to do like science A-levels and going to be a scientist. So I was very lucky that I got to go to Cambridge, and I did natural sciences, which for me was a really great degree because it's basically a pick and mix. Because I knew I kind of liked biochemistry, I like sort of molecular biology things, less keen on whole organisms. So as soon as we get to like an animal, I'm out. But I really like cells and genes and DNA and all that kind of stuff. And so I studied that, did a whole bunch of physiology, chemistry, all sorts of different things. And then I knew that I wanted to do a PhD, because that's what you do when you're a scientist, right? You do a PhD. So I looked around in Cambridge places to do a PhD, and, I could say that I ended up doing a PhD in genomic imprinting in an epigenetics lab. This is the early days of epigenetics when it was really weird, because it's a fascinating phenomenon and I want to study it. But the actual really honest answer is that I was looking through all sorts of these prospectuses from various research institutes, and I saw a transgenic mouse, like a blue sort of mouse embryo. I was like, I want to make that. I want to make blue mice. So, and this was the only lab that had like transgenic mice in the prospectus. I was like, I want to make blue mice. That's just really cool. And I remember ages ago, there was a BBC Horizon documentary. This is a long time ago. So I was at uni in the 90s. So this is way back. But it was all about Hox genes. And this was sort of the discovery that these fundamental patterning genes that pattern our bodies, and they're in all organisms. Every single organism has Hox genes. They're very simple, and then they get multiplied up, and that's how we make, complex patterned organisms. And that really, for me, turned me on to developmental biology, the idea that genes are the same across all organisms, but mixed up and like remixed in different ways to make us who we are. And so I'm really fascinated by this. So I did my PhD in what's now the Gurdon Institute with Azim Sarani. It was on genomic imprinting. Yes, the weird first album of epigenetics that I was in at. And I just got really fascinated by the questions that the whole institute was set up to answer, like how do you go from one cell to an organism? So that's developmental biology. And then also, which will tie in later, this question of how do you go from one cell to a cancer? So this is almost like through the dark mirror of development. So I was really liked the way that those sort of the light and the dark sides of life, building organisms and building cancer, had been tied together in this one institute. My problem was is that I'm not really great as a scientist. I get distracted really easily. I'm very, very clumsy. Every day, every week, I wanted to do a different experiment. And that's quite hard when you're trying to do a PhD. You've got to be focused and do experiments that work. And so I just kept getting distracted. My thesis is like 4 completely different unrelated mini research projects that I sort of smushed together. There's no coherence to it whatsoever. I'm amazed that I got it, really. And then I was like, right, well, I've had a bit of a difficult time in my PhD, so maybe I want to go on and do a postdoc. So I got a grant to stay on in the lab and do a postdoc, sort of finishing up some stuff I was doing. Then I went to London because I was like, well, the full story is I wanted to go to the US. I wanted to go to Edinburgh. I got offered postdocs in 5 different postdocs in Edinburgh doing epigenetics.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very cool with all the big epigenetics people. And then my partner at the time said that he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go to America, certainly, and he certainly didn't want to go to Edinburgh either. And I gave in. I was like, well, where do you want to go? It's like, London, because he was a doctor. I'm like, oh, the only place in the world where they have doctors is London. So that's where we went. And I lasted about 18 months, and it was a very, very difficult time. Didn't have a great time, very depressed. Also now stuck with this man who, but at this point, I really deeply resent. So we broke up after a while, and I left the lab. So it was interesting, my journey out of the lab, because even from when I was a student, I'd been doing science communication. I'd been getting involved in science fairs and writing for the university newspaper for Varsity and all this kind of stuff, and like getting involved in like the Naked Scientist radio show. And I didn't realise that could be a career. And then I met people from the Association of British Science Writers, and I was like, there's this whole world of like science writing and science communication. And I got a job at Cancer Research UK to do that, and that was in 2004, and that was like, this is my thing. So I did that I was there for 12 years, but also, again, because I have a really short attention span, I was doing like freelance writing and more radio and podcasting and all that kind of thing, and sort of went from there. And I got offered a book deal in 2014 by Bloomsbury Sigma, who was setting up their new line of science books, and they were looking for like young upcoming science writers, and I guess that was me at the time.
So you didn't send a proposal, they approached you?
No, I got approached on Twitter. This was back when Twitter was cool.
Wow.
Because I was tweeting about science and stuff, and this guy like slid into my DMs. Okay, he was like, have you ever thought about writing a book? I'm like, this is a niche chat up line. And I was like, do you want to come for lunch? I guess so. And he was legit. He was the editor, and he's like, we're setting up a new line of science books at Bloomsbury, and you seem like someone who'd be up for writing one. And at this point, I hadn't written more than like a feature of 2,000 words. So I thought, a book's quite a lot. But I was writing features and all sorts of things. And I kind of knew that a book was the next thing I wanted to do to like springboard me out of my career at CLUK and then into being a author, broadcaster. So yeah, in 2016, I quit my job, brought out my first book, Herding Hemingway's Cats, which is all about how our genes work. And I would say the rest is history, but the rest is them hustling and working harder than I ever have done in my entire life for like 2 years, trying everything. I said yes to everything. I wrote anything for anyone that would have it and ideally pay me for it. Loads of radio, loads of podcasting. Got more work than I could deal with, particularly from like institutions and organisations and companies. Like, we cannot find someone who can get the science but then really communicate the science. I started getting people to help me do that, and then realised I was running an agency, and sort of here we are. So I've been running First Create the Media since 2018. We're a science communications agency, and then also since that time I've also written Rebel Cell. How to Code a Human's a weird book because it's more of like a school library version of my first book. So it's more about like gene regulation for children, I suppose.
Yeah, very cool.
And yeah, carried on doing bits and bobs of radio and keeping busy.
Yes, I can see that, because a PhD thesis itself is like writing a book alone, a very sciencey book, but then switching gear and communicating that science to your audience is quite different, I think. So how was Rebel Cell born from the time after which you quit Cancer Research UK, founded your company, published your first book? How did Rebel Cell come about? Was that also somebody approaching you, or did you kind of go down the more traditional route of like proposing this book?
Yeah, this was a proper proposal. So Herding Hemingway's Cats did really well for a first author niche book about gene regulation. So that was pretty good. And I was like, oh, I really like that. Rebel Cell is actually the first book I wanted to write. So I'd had in my mind since 2012, 2014, that there was a book that needed to be written about the new science of where we're at with cancer. So around, I think it was 2010, 2011, this book, The Emperor of All Maladies, was published by Siddhartha Mukherjee. And people were like, well, that's the cancer book. This is how sad I am. So I took that book on my honeymoon. I took that and then Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. I'm now divorced. So, but they were good books to read. I had a good time. But yeah, so people were like, well, this cancer book, this is the definitive book about cancer, right? It's been written. But I was stewing on this idea that our knowledge of cancer took a bit of like a quantum leap, I think, from 2014, particularly with the publication of a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that really demonstrated that cancer is incredibly heterogeneous within the body. Like even little clumps of cells next to each other in the same tumour, in the same patient, can be genetically different. And that this is like maps out an evolution of these groups of cells within the body. And this was something that we really hadn't understood about cancer before. And I was like, I think that there's something in here. But I was still working for CRUK. I still enjoyed my job and I also enjoyed being paid regularly. And so when Jim approached me to write for Bloomsbury Sigma, I was like, I don't want to write a cancer book yet because I also think that there's more science to come. So like I said, when I was at the Gurdon Institute, I'd always been interested in this question of how do you go from one cell to many? And in development, you do it the right way, and in cancer, you do it the wrong way. But it's all the same genes and it's all the same processes. And this idea of embedding cancer as a biological phenomenon, and almost like an inevitable biological phenomenon, because we are multicellular, because our cells have these programs in them for division and differentiation and all the kind of stuff that they do. But you can hijack those and co-opt those in cancer. And no one was writing about cancer from this evolutionary perspective, from this like organismal perspective, from a thinking about it as like a tissue disease. We're very much in the mode of like precision oncology, find the mutations, target mutations. And I was like, this is a whole angle on cancer that no one's writing and talking about. And I got an agent. So my agent, a really fantastic guy. And he's like, right, well, we're going to write a proper proposal and sample chapter and we'll take it round a load of publishers. And every single publisher said, yeah, but like there's already this book, like The Emperor of All Maladies. So we've got a cancer book. And I'm like, that came out over a decade ago and the science has moved on so much and this evolutionary idea is not being talked about. And they're like, yeah, but he like wrote that book and it did really well. It got a Pulitzer. I know. My book has not won a Pulitzer, I will say. So it was really hard to sell. One publisher offered me a deal. That was Weinfeld and Nicholson. Thank you very much, guys. And that's how I have a book.
Amazing. So that is really interesting because, as you said, I think many people, including researchers, everyone who works here, the oncologists, the patients, we think of cancer as an enemy to be eradicated. In Rebel Cell, you suggest that this framing may be too simplistic. And like you said, the research has moved on to show that there is clonal evolution happening within cancer, even within the same person. It's changing all the time, responding to signals within the body from the environment. So what sort of mindset shift do we need to replace metaphors like the war on cancer that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, I really, with this book, I wanted to embed the idea of cancer as an inevitable biological phenomenon, that it starts from within us and there is nothing we can do to stop that. And I was really careful when I was writing the book because there's a lot of ideas of like people blame themselves for getting cancer, or like it must be something that happened or something that they did. And like there's definitely things that don't help, right? I talk about like don't add to your mutational burden unnecessarily. Like just being alive causes mutations. The real the mind-bending thing for me, so there's two papers that really blew my mind and really laid the foundation for the ideas in the book. So one was the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine about the heterogeneity within a patient. And the other one was the work of Peter Campbell and the team at the Sanger Institute. They're like, normal tissue is full of mutations. And mutations that if we found those in a cancer, we would say that that was a cancer tissue and that was driving cancer cells. And yet those are normal tissues. And this idea that like by the time you get to a certain age, not very old, you are a patchwork of mutation. Like Peter, when I went to talk to Peter Campbell, he's sort of like, it's like appearing like you are a patchwork of mutation. Like, oh my God. But this is biology. Like we are heterogeneous and clonal and full of mutations. So we need to be asking the questions about not almost like why do we not get cancer all the time? What keeps our tissues healthy and what keeps our tissues healthy for so long, like into our 60s, and then it all gets a bit loose. So thinking about cancer from that perspective, and then also, so that's about our understanding of what cancer is and where it comes from and how we might actually prevent it. And then the other flip side of that is then how do we treat it? So this understanding that cancer is really an evolutionary speciation event within us. And there are forces, like some of the more targeted treatments just reinforce that. They're selective pressures. So viewing the treatment of cancer through a more evolutionary lens, thinking also about cancer as like a phenotype. It's been very easy to look at, and this is kind of my first book as well, Hemingway's Cats, was like moving from genotype to phenotype. We can study genes, we can sequence loads of genes. It's really easy to sequence genes. What's really hard is to study phenotype. And you can study an organism and go, oh, these genes probably contribute to its phenotype in this way. We really need to do that for cancer, because we've gone down this paradigm of treating cancer where we can sequence loads of stuff. Brilliant. Precision medicine, personalized medicine, whatever you want to call it, find a mutation. Here's a drug that targets that mutated protein. And they can give months of benefit in the right combination, sometimes years of benefit. But this is not like the curative paradigm you would think. And that's because of evolution. And we're not targeting the cancer phenotype. We're still targeting individual mutations. So trying to get researchers and doctors to think about cancer as an evolutionary phenomenon and as a phenotype within like that emerges from our tissue. It's an emergent property of tissues. So I think that's kind of a bit of a very different shift in the way that you think about cancer.
Interesting. But there's still a really big gap, I think, between the science and public. And I think I noticed it most when I became a patient myself last year, finding out that I carry a germline BRCA1 mutation and going through all of these publications, because I work in esophageal cancer. So I didn't know the breast cancer literature very well, and sifting through this data desperately while trying to make sense of everything that was happening, thinking about my future ovarian cancer risk and all of these things. The medical jargon isn't very easy to be read as a scientifically trained patient. So I wonder how patients who don't have, a PhD in these things that teaches you how to tear a paper apart and, find the limitations and see the loopholes and actually what could be interesting and beneficial and worth evaluating further from actually, this is a really poorly designed study and maybe you should take it with a pinch of salt. So I think it's really difficult to do that. Even amongst ourselves as scientists, we could make things a lot simpler because, things just don't make sense and people love to overcomplicate and don't necessarily tell their story in the way that could make most impact because it's very difficult to understand. So how did you take so many different concepts? So you spoke to so many people, so much literature in the book that was so helpful for me because I don't necessarily know all of these studies that were done, whether they were done, 20 years ago or like in the past 10 years. How did you make such scientific theories and findings accessible to readers without oversimplifying?
Oh, that is a tough question because, the first person I had to make them simple for was me. So it was a hard thing. My first book was a hard thing. In this book is marshalling all that information and trying to put it into some kind of narrative framework and what goes in and what stays out and what do I think is a good study and what do I think is a bit iffy. So I am sort of curating the information. I will, even when I find something that's oh, that's an amazing story, it's not a bit too good to be true, I will try and be, a bit cynical about it. That it does frustrate me incredibly when you see scientific studies that are there's this thing and science says this, and you look at the papers Does it though? That's like 3 people, and I'm not sure about that. And there's some fields of science that are a lot more susceptible to that than others. Nutrition. But yeah, and that does touch on cancer, because I think, cancer is something that we all care about, we all worry about. And it is the responsibility of researchers, if you are ethical and have integrity, to try and represent what you understand to be the truth, and to provide a value judgment of like, well, there is this finding, but actually, I think it's interesting, but I don't think this is the amazing thing. I did get a bit carried away, I think, with adaptive therapy, because I do think like the big study that's been done, it's not a big study, it's a small study, but kind of saying like, this is really incredible, but it is still the first step to, we do need to do this in a lot more cancers. It's not going to work for every cancer. So I think it does behove us as researchers to say where the caveats are, but to like say them in a, an interesting way that doesn't completely like piss on people's chips, because the kind of the glimmers of interest today are the big discoveries of tomorrow, or they are the, we don't work on that anymore, So I think we do need to think about, how do we judge this stuff and then communicate it without just running amok over every single study that looks interesting. It is only 20 people. But at the same time, I think it is good to be critical of some of the things that are established. I do kind of like looking out for the more, not controversial, I think. I think I like to look for the things that are interesting and plausible, but for some reason are not being looked at. Some of the people who are like, oh, they're just a bit cranky or whatever. It's like, well, let's look at what is there and what is really there, and actually tease it out properly. So I found some quite interesting stories and ways of thinking in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one bit, I think it was in chapter 7, where you talk about like the tumor microenvironment and this American study in 2018, which was done in mice, where they scattered these single breast cancer cells in the mouse. And then for 8 months, there was nothing. They were just sleeping. Nothing happened until they kind of induced or mimicked a nasty lung infection in these mice. And then the cancer cells woke up and kind of metastasized, spread everywhere. And then they realized that the reason was due to these inflammatory cytokines that were released by neutrophils that were triggered by this infection. And similarly also with tobacco chemicals, I think, put into the mice. Yet we know that studies looking at anti-inflammatory steroid use in preventing breast cancer or reducing recurrence rates actually increase the spread of breast cancer. So you can kind of see that inflammation does trigger carcinogenesis to some extent, but actually it's not as simple as just, repurposing a drug just because we see a pattern. And I think going back to your comment about nutrition, that was one thing that really frustrated me while I was under treatment.
Would you have some turmeric?
Yes, I have some turmeric. And oh my goodness. And now that I'm in remission, does kind of, because I know that all of my cells are carrying this mutation, they've already been hit. So I wonder if like stress will increase it, or any kind of inflammation because of whatever I do in my day-to-day will trigger that process again. And, it is scary. So at first I was really careful. I was, trying not to eat anything processed, no chocolate bars, nothing, just trying to be as healthy as possible. But that's just not sustainable. And, you do need to live a little bit as well. And then like you reading about this study suggests that actually, yes, you can try to be as anti-inflammatory as you want, but it's not that simple. And you can't, going back to your commentary on the sugar in the book as well, which also Dr. Liz O'Riordan also talks about.
Yeah.
You can do more damage than good by starving your body of sugar, because actually then the cancer cells will maybe migrate somewhere where they can take that sugar.
Or you just need energy to get through treatment. I mean, it's awful. So when I was at Cancer Research UK, I was kind of on the like alternative medicine beat. So all the stuff that was like, sugar is poison, sugar feeds cancer, or like the alternative treatments, I would investigate them, because I think it's not helpful when people believe this stuff. It's not helpful to just go, well, it's just shit, right? Don't be stupid. It's like they're believing it for a reason, because it's telling a story that they are finding plausible. So understanding what is that story that's being told, what is the germs of truth in it, if any, and then how do we unpack that and point out, using the best communication skills we have, what is actually the case. So I think that stuff is really important, just rather than just dismissing this stuff. It's like, it's nonsense, because people believe this for a reason, and they believe it because it's a compelling story to them that feels true. So
Absolutely.
you've got to understand where people are coming from. And that's always been the case. You can look someone in the eye and you can say, oh yeah, cancer survival's doubled and all this kind of thing. And then they say, well, my mother's just died, and so I don't believe you. And that's true, because their lived experience does not match what you're telling them. So, it can't be that you can't tell a story that will resonate with absolutely everyone, but understanding where people are coming from, I think is really, really important. And one of the things I was really aware of when I was writing the book was how this would land with patients and the families of patients. And it's been really nice to have feedback from people with cancer, people who've come through and out the other side, to say, there's a lot of blame around cancer. Like, you did something wrong, you ate something wrong, you didn't do this, you did that. And to help people understand that this is our human biology, and there's things we do that maybe don't help, but also there's just a massive load of bad luck. And I really delved deep into the bad luck paper, and then I tore myself right up in knots trying to explain some of there's this big sort of statistical paper looking at different tissues and all this kind of stuff, but trying to get across that this is biology. There's nothing you can pin on one thing that you did. For everyone, you can have 20 people who are smokers and get cancer, and you can have people who smoke all their lives and didn't get cancer. There's less of them, so statistically that tells you something, and you need to tell that story honestly. Yeah. But it's with things like this, it's not a one-to-one. We are up against our fundamental biology here, and I think making that clear, and that you can't fight your biology. Absolutely. Unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think the frustrating thing also is that social media can be a great thing to kind of amplify these amazing findings and, get through to patients and share patient stories, but also it can help to spread misinformation like wildfire, which I think we get cookies are watching everything that we do. And obviously I was specifically targeted by these, what are they called? Oncology nutritionists and people's reels on Instagram. And I was like, at some point I just had to be like, do you know what? I don't actually think I have a very unhealthy diet. So I will keep eating my Mediterranean, fish with vegetables and whatever. And if every now and then I want to have a bit of cake, then, that's okay.
I mean, have cake, have the bloody cake. At the other point, we are human, and life is short, and biology is real, and are we going to have cake? I think that is sometimes the saddest thing, is that people can really, really tie themselves up in knots, and the blame and the shame and the guilt that is all tied up around some of the narratives about cancer, I think is so damaging. It's damaging for people going through cancer. It's damaging for people living with cancer. It's damaging for families as well, and people who've lost people to cancer. And I think it really is trying to think about, why are people telling these stories? They're telling them because they're easy, they're compelling. Certainly, it's interesting you sort of bring up nutrition. Generally, I don't want to sound all like RFK here, but general education in medical schools about nutrition is absolutely dreadful. What is a good, healthy, nourishing diet for people going through serious medical treatment? And it's not just cancer, it's all sorts of things. What actually can people do to support their health? I have a medical condition I'm living with, and there's stuff that I know that is useful, and the stuff that I know that is not useful. And I'm going to just try and do most of the stuff that I think's useful, and not too much of the stuff that's less useful. But also, I'm only on this planet once, and it is my own choice. I think that's the other thing as well, is accepting people's autonomy in the choices that they're going to make, and doing that without laying blame and guilt, which I think so much of these narratives sort of inadvertently or subconsciously put on people.
So given what you've uncovered in researching Rebel Cell, where do you think our which directions do you think the most exciting breakthroughs in cancer prevention, diagnosis, or treatment are likely to come from in the next decade?
Ooh. So I do want to see more of a focus on cancer prevention. Having just talked about lifestyle, there is the really obvious dumb stuff like smoking. I would just like to see no more smoking. I think we know now that smoking, not just in terms of cancer risk, but in terms of so many health things, it's probably one of the worst things you can do for your health. It's also incredibly addictive. And I think ways that we can just stop people starting smoking would be very, very good. I think I raise in the book as well things like infectious diseases. So 1 in 5 cancers worldwide is due to an infectious agent. So there's so much there. There's it's really low hanging fruit, but because they're not cancers that affect people in us nice sort of rich Western countries, they are of less interest, unfortunately. So I think that there is a lot of stuff that could be done there. Obviously, we're sitting in the Early Cancer Institute, so early diagnosis, I think, is really interesting. But I think that early diagnosis and prevention does need to start from this understanding of cancer as a disease of tissues. So the studies that are showing that as we get older, we are just patchworks of clonal mutations. So it's not just about the mutations, right? There's something else. There's something in the tissue, and there's something about the point at which, when you get older, how does your biology change? So the question is not what necessarily why do we get cancer when we're older? It's why do we not get cancer when we're younger? And that is a really interesting question. And so I think drilling into that and what is it about our tissues? There's quite an outdated theory called field theory, which I got really into, reading all these old books about it. But it is this idea that cancer is emergent out of tissue. So it's not just you've got one cell that's got the hit by one mutation and that's going to become your cancer cell. You're already all carrying one mutation that we definitely know about in all your cells. But not all your cells are going to become cancer cells. Not all of my cells are going to become cancer cells. So why is that? So that, I think, is the really interesting question. And for things like people who carry alterations in the BRCA genes, why is it just those tissues? These are really interesting questions.
And those questions I actually been thinking about and kind of drowning in these internal, it's like a crisis. When did it happen? When was the first division within the cancer? Why did it happen in the breast and not in that breast and not the other breast? Why is it that, I'm more likely to get breast and ovarian cancer, but not skin cancer? Because it's just a DNA repair deficiency. I mean, it's called a breast cancer gene, but that's just what we've called it. Why does it affect the breast? And what was the timeline like? I think in your book where you speak about your colleague who was diagnosed with a BRCA2 induced breast cancer, you speak about the fact that every cell in her body is carrying a broken copy of the BRCA2 gene, which she got from her mum. And of all the trillions of cells within her body, a significant proportion of them will also have accidentally damaged the functional BRCA2 backup copy that she got from her dad. All those 2 hit cells have seriously impaired DNA repair toolkits. So why did she only get cancer in one breast? And all of our cells contain the same collection of 20,000 genes, but they aren't all switched on at the same time. And I'm what is the timeline? When does it happen? Yeah. How quickly did it grow? And then I look back at photos and I'm was it there when I was doing this thing? Or did it happen in 2 months? Or was it a year? Or was it 2 years? And why did I, find it at that specific moment? It's just all, yeah.
It is so fascinating and horrifying to think about it. But I think also this understanding that we are a patchwork of mutations, and within us all, you've probably got more mutations in there, honey. As have I, as have all of us. And I think that understanding of, so why not? And that, I think, is where the key to prevention really lies. It's what keeps damaged cells in check? Well, what makes damaged cells grow and multiply, but what keeps damaged cells in check so that they don't? And seeing it as this phenomenon in the tissue, and then how does that control get looser as we get older? I think that is such an interesting area to drill into. And then in terms of treatment, I mean, there's lots and lots of different ideas. I think these sort of more evolutionary ideas of different ways of giving treatments that are much more evolutionary informed, more rational combinations and timings of different drugs, I think is very interesting. And then also because in between like researching the book, writing the book and publishing the book, like immunotherapy basically exploded. I didn't want to make it a book that was all about immunotherapy because even though I think that's incredibly interesting. So immunotherapy is a bit of a sidebar in it. But I do think like the way that we're starting to understand the immune system, because really like the way you catch a monster is you set a bigger monster on it, and the immune system is an evolutionary force. It's our own evolutionary task force. So the way to like trap an evolutionary being like a cancer is to have an evolving, it's like, I don't know, a universal predator or something. Is to have like something that is up to the task and can evolve and modify itself within us as well. So I do think like, I don't think immunotherapy is the be all and end all and is going to cure all cancers, but I think it's very powerful. And I think we're only just starting to understand it and work out how to get it to work for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And to kind of wrap up just on a weird and interesting note, if you could invite one figure from the history of science, whether they are alive or long gone, who would it be? You know, and if you could get them to read Rebel Cell and then debate your ideas with you over coffee, who would you choose and what would you most want to ask them?
So I love this question because I had one for Rebel Cell. I also had one for my first book, Herding Hemingway's Cats, because I think my favourite scientist of all time is Barbara McClintock. I think she thought about the phenotype of organisms and how like what's going on in the genes translates to the organism. And I think she would be really interested. So in my first book, it's all about this quest to understand how genotype gives us phenotype. And this is sort of the same idea for cancer, is like, how does genotype, how does all these mutations combine to give us this monstrous phenotype? So I think that she would find this quite interesting. I think also someone who, the obvious question is, the answer is like, oh, Charles Darwin. I think Darwin would be really interested to see how his theory of evolution has like informed this and to understand that like cancers evolve in the body and all this clonal evolution and stuff. But I think a more interesting evolutionary biologist is the one that gets overlooked, and that's Alfred Russel Wallace. And he was like working at the same time as Darwin, shared loads of ideas with him. Alfred Russel Wallace was, to me, feels a lot more like attuned to organisms and the environment and a bit less cerebral than Darwin. He was really hands-on. And I think that, I'm sure Darwin would find this interesting. And I write about Charles Darwin in the book because like, he's the guy everyone knows. But I find the more interesting evolutionary biologist is Alfred Russel Wallace. So it's like, I think he'd like that too. I find it cool.
Amazing. Very cool. Thank you so much for your time, Kat. And what kind of ending or takeaway key message do you want to leave our audience with?
Please buy my book. You made me very happy. I think just all the time in all my books, I've been trying to like pull things together. And I talk about this quite a lot, the idea that like when you're a scientist, you're just going like an inch wide and a mile deep on something. You get really, really into it. But I think there's so many ideas and parallels come by like looking much more broadly. I go around when I'm researching my books, I've gone around, I talk to a lot of people. And these are like amazing scientists and like people at the top of their game. And then I tell them about a paper and they're like, oh, I didn't know about that. And I feel like a little sort of bee going around like pollinating people with these sort of sometimes quite wild ideas from somewhere completely over here to over here. So I think that taking your head up and looking around and seeing the parallels, because like evolution is everywhere. Evolution is in all forms of life, but we also see it in things like, the evolution of policies and decision making. Like, why does stuff get so snarled up? It's like, well, because it's easier to add things and botch things together than it is to actually refine and take away. And it's like, and that's why our genomes are full of nonsense, because there's no mechanism for getting rid of that stuff. So I think that there's a lot to be had by like looking more broadly and looking around.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And one final note.
Oh.
Can I please ask you to sign my book.
Oh, I will, but I'm not going to sign it with a biro because that is an amateur move. So, AHSEN? Always check, top writer tip, always check the spelling.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a joy to have you.